Welcome to the RCVRC's 2019 Symposium, Building a Solid Foundation. The first session, Demystifying RCV, will begin shortly. My name is Rosemary Blizzard, and I am the Business Manager, Communications Director of the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. First, a few housekeeping matters. Participants have been muted for this session to reduce audio interference since we have such a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so that we may try to assist. If you have a question or comment regarding the webinar, please type that message in the question box. Session 1 will be about 45 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post along with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. For those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and firsthand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting with a focus on election administration, since that's our background. The website, rankedchoicevoting.org, and our other resources have been developed as educational tools for election administrators, policymakers, voters, candidates, and others. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does Ranked Choice Voting. Both are building a solid foundation, and we hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and the conduct of elections. So without further ado, let's kick off this symposium by discussing some common misconceptions and misunderstandings of ranked choice voting. The RCVRC team will be presenting this session, and I'll take some time to introduce each of us now. While serving as the North Carolina State Board of Elections Executive Director for 20 years, Gary Bartlett moved the state to the national forefront of elections administration. The agency developed innovative and efficient processes and gained national recognition as a model in managing voter registration at non-election offices such as DMV, establishing one of the first certification programs for election officials, conducting wellness checks to ensure compliance and uniformity in the county election offices, and was the first state elections office in the United States to implement technology to ensure voters received the proper ballots. Also during his tenure, North Carolina conducted the first statewide instant runoff voting election in the era of modern voting machines. Gary has served on numerous federal boards and commissions. He continues to be featured as a panelist and recognized authority regarding election administration. Since 2006, Karen Brinson Bell has worked in election administration, including 4 years as an elections director for Transylvania County, North Carolina, and 5 years with the North Carolina State Board of Elections Voting Systems Division. She conducted RCV elections at the municipal level in 2007 and 2009, and statewide and at the district level in 2010. A certified project management professional, PMP, Karen has also completed coursework towards the Election Center's SARA designation. She is a certified North Carolina elections administrator and has participated in panels and reports for the Elections Assistance Commission and the Brennan Center for Justice. During her time with the RCVRC, Karen has given testimony or analysis about ranked choice voting to officials across the country, including Alaska, California, Washington, Missouri, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, and New York City. Chris Hughes is the Policy Director and Counsel for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He makes sure administrators, activists, and policymakers are speaking the same language when it comes to ranked choice voting, from legislative drafting through Election Day. He has worked on RCV legislation in more than a dozen states and has presented on RCV implementation to the Washington State Association of County Auditors, the Maryland General Assembly, and others. He also co-produces the RCVRC's podcast, RCV Clips. You can follow him on Twitter at @ThisChrisHughes. Chris is also admitted to practice law in the state of New York. From 1988 to 2013, George Gilbert served as Director of Elections for Guilford County, North Carolina, a jurisdiction with over 360,000 registered voters, including the cities of Greensboro and High Point. During his tenure, George administered over 65 elections, including 7 presidential. George was a nationally certified election registration administrator and served on and co-chaired multiple committees tasked with improving election administration across the country. He also participated in Election Assistance Commission working groups in the development of best practices publications issued by the EAC and served on the North Carolina Uniformity Standards Working Group. As for me, I began my elections career in 1999 as a director for Duplin County, North Carolina. From 2004 to 2011, I worked with the North Carolina State Board of Elections as a voter registration director and as a district elections technician. During that time, I helped the state's 100 counties implement HAVA and assisted with the statewide rollout of voting equipment in 2006. Prior to joining the Resource Center, I also served as an elections director for Wayne County, North Carolina, and worked as a staff accountant for a full-service CPA firm, including a focus on local government financial audits. Now that you've met each of us, it's time to dive in on RCV myths. We'll start with Gary Bartlett.
Thank you, Rosemary. Hello and welcome. As the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center team and I have made presentations, provided testimony, or even replied to emails over the past few years, questions often come from misunderstanding or misconception about ranked choice voting. We feel education is the key to addressing these mischaracterizations. So we have put together this presentation to cut through the confusion, provide clear information about some of the most common misconceptions, and to explain how RCV works, like any other election process. Our answers are based on first-hand knowledge, outcomes in jurisdictions around the country, and data that tell the reality of RCV. Rosemary Blizzard will address our first myth about RCV.
Thanks, Gary. The first myth we'll cover is that ranked choice voting is confusing and complicated. Many of you joining us today have probably heard this one a few times. Here are some key points about why this voting method is actually pretty well understood by voters. Ranked choice voting is a simple process that most people pick up quickly. Most every day of our lives, we make choices and rank our preferences. You wake up planning to have your favorite coffee, only to find that your partner has had the last of the hazelnut, so you opt for the caramel macchiato. Without thinking, you just ranked your coffee choices, because going without caffeine should never be a choice. Maybe you're planning a trip with friends. You imagine a restful trip to the beach, but some of the others throw out ideas like shopping and Broadway shows in New York, or sightseeing in DC. Clearly, your friends want a more active vacation. While your first choice may not have been the preference of the others, by unknowingly ranking the various ideas, you pick a trip that in the end works for the majority of the group. These are just some day-to-day examples of ranking our preferences. So applying this concept to voting is really quite simple and intuitive. Data drives home this point. Recent RCV elections have experienced success and low levels of invalidated ballots. Take Santa Fe, for instance. Looking at their first use of RCV in March 2018, 96% of the ballots cast counted in the final round of the mayoral election, meaning that 96% of the voters ranked one of the two candidates who continued all the way through the counting process. Of the 4% not part of the final round, we know that just 1/3 of 1% of ballots had no cast vote in the contest. The other 3.7% of ballots ran out of rankings from voters and therefore could not be considered. Given that the machines in Santa Fe alerted people when they did not rank all candidates, it's likely that those 3.7% of voters simply didn't want to rank either of the final two candidates in the race, not that they didn't understand how to rank more candidates. Looking at Minneapolis, the data also shows effective ballot marking, which we translate as voters having strong understanding of the voting method. When reviewing whether voters ranked all three choices in 2013 in the various races, we can see that the mayor's race, which had 35 candidates, scored the highest with 76.3% of voters ranking 3 candidates. In 2017, 72.5% of voters used all 3 ranks. In all other races with 3 candidates or more, the majority of the voters chose to rank more than 1 candidate. We've also learned through the Minneapolis city government surveys of voters after each of the 3 RCV election cycles that an average of 92% of voters found RCV, quote, easy to do, and strongly support the continued use of the voting method. Exit polling in Santa Fe last year found that more than 84% of respondents felt that they understood RCV. Not depicted, but still similar findings during exit polling in Hendersonville and Cary, North Carolina in 2007. At least 86% of voters said their first time voting a ballot with RCV contests was, quote, easy to very easy to understand. Clearly, voters indicate that RCV is not confusing or complicated. Rather, they are effectively marking their ballots and ranking their preferences among the candidates in the contests. Now, Karen Brinson-Bell will talk about myth number 2.
Thanks, Rosemary. Myth number 2 is that ranked choice voting is expensive, especially during the initial implementation. In reality, RCV has the potential to save taxpayer dollars. Here's how. The cost of conducting, got ahead of myself on the bullet points. The cost of conducting an election using ranked choice voting varies by jurisdiction. How much one jurisdiction can spend varies. How much one jurisdiction can spend versus another is directly tied to how voting is administered, the type of voting equipment or voting system used, and existing election administration practices. Some costs may be one-time, while others may be reoccurring. Additionally, jurisdictions that adopt RCV to eliminate a runoff or primary find that implementing RCV instead of funding a full but historically low turnout election creates considerable savings in taxpayer dollars and productivity. Costs that may be incurred are software or voting equipment upgrades if the current system cannot design RCV ballots or cannot tabulate RCV contests. However, the 4 largest suppliers of voting systems in our country today have RCV capabilities in their latest systems. The cost to activate or add an RCV module or component is generally minimal to the expense of the cost for a runoff or primary election. The Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center has also developed free open source tabulation software to tabulate and aggregate RCV contests from systems that can generate cast vote records. This is another cost savings to the jurisdictions. Any additional costs for a longer ballot or additional postage for mailing ballots also minimally impacts budgets. Many jurisdictions already invest in outreach and education, whether RCV is being used or not. For jurisdictions without these practices in place, funding for outreach and education, poll worker training, and additional poll workers or personnel may be beneficial in conducting the election. Some jurisdictions have allocated the fund for these practices upon adopting RCV, while others have not and have still held successful elections. Both Maine in 2018 and North Carolina in 2010 were charged with conducting statewide RCV elections without additional funding. Both found resources within their existing budgets for statewide voter education and upgrades or workarounds to tabulate the RCV contests. For Maine's 2018 statewide primary, the Secretary of State's office indicated in their August 2018 webinar for the Resource Center that a typical primary costs approximately $250,000. The additional cost to conduct ranked choice voting in the primary election came in just over $102,000. This included the cost of software and hardware upgrades, lease of a high-speed ballot tabulator, and the courier service to transport ballots or flash drives because of the need to centrally tabulate the ballots at the state's office. While we do not want to suggest that voter education should not be an investment, we do encourage jurisdictions to consider ongoing voter education efforts, to look at cost-effective measures, and to partner with organizations like the League of Women Voters and others who can be good messengers. The size and demographics of a jurisdiction shape the type of voter education effort that should take place. Sometimes an insert in a utility bill can reach a majority of voters, while in other locations, advertising with wraps or signage on buses may be more effective. Just depends on the jurisdiction. The Resource Center has information on the cost in various jurisdictions, but it's important to compare apples to apples when discussing implementation costs. In the end, no matter the size of the jurisdiction, the most impactful messaging to voters, and actually has no cost, is good oral and written instruction when the voter arrives at the polling place or receives their ballot, which is an outreach effort that ultimately reaches every voter participating in the election. Next up is Chris Hughes to discuss several myths we often hear about the RCV counting process and results.
Thanks, Karen. So the first myth that I'll address is that single winner RCV does not guarantee a majority winner. The argument regarding achieving a majority is often made to undermine the claim that RCV promotes majority rule, which elevates semantics over substance. Here's what we know. RCV does not necessarily guarantee a winner with a majority of the votes cast in the first round, but neither do plurality or runoff elections. However, ranked choice voting does guarantee the winner will earn a majority of the votes counting in the final round, as you can see on in the images on the next slide. Runoff elections also guarantee a majority in the runoff round, but there's a clear distinction between traditional runoff elections and ranked choice voting. Runoffs don't guarantee that the candidate who wins in the runoff will have earned more than half of the votes cast in the initial election. RCV routinely outperforms runoffs in this respect by ensuring that the vast majority of people participating in the first round have a vote count in the deciding round. You can see this in Santa Fe, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and other RCV jurisdictions, where the final round in an RCV election routinely counts more votes than in a comparable runoff election. And the images on this slide are from our work with the Center for Civic Design. It's just their most simple visual explanation of the round by round counting process in ranked choice voting, or in a single winner ranked choice voting election. So I'll move on to myth 4 now, which also deals with RCV results, specifically the concern that RCV delays results in an election. I think it's important to frame this concern properly. Are people worried about election night results in RCV or final certified results of their elections? If you're worried about final results, RCV shouldn't introduce any new problems. How long election results take to post is primarily a consequence of when ballots are processed, regardless of the voting method being used, whether you're using ranked choice voting, plurality, or any other voting method. Election night results, on the other hand, from the first round will be available no matter what voting system is used. The winners of the election won't be confirmed until later, which is the same for non-RCV contests as well. Depending on a jurisdiction's capabilities and practices, including voter familiarity with RCV and how ballots or the ballot data in a contest gets centralized, unofficial round-by-round results may be available on election night, while others may take a bit longer to provide unofficial results. San Francisco, for example, and Bay Area cities currently provide round-by-round results on election night and update those round-by-round results over the following few days as they process absentee ballots because so many ballots are cast by mail in California. And building on that, processing subsequent rounds of counting can be considered a natural progression of the canvass process, much like with provisional and absentee ballot processing now. Understanding the canvass or certification process is also a good place to bring in the media, who, if educated, can help allay voter concerns about how their votes get counted or handled in an RCV race. And you can see examples of this sort of transparency in Maine, where the Secretary of State's office regularly posted photos and videos of their RCV process as the count continued during their June 2018 and November 2018 RCV elections. Press attention was really high, and voters appreciated the clear lines of communication from the state. And then in terms of actual time to tabulate, it's worth remembering that outcomes from RCV elections can be determined within the same time frame as any election that is certified, but the outcome of runoff or primary elections requires an additional election and weeks or months to know who moves forward. And then one final note on tabulation and results of RCV contests. Once all votes are assembled, the tabulation takes less than a minute per race when using any currently available RCV tabulation software. So again, the bottleneck is really in your ballot processing and not in the tabulation, the round by round count of ranked choice voting. So without any further delay, we'll talk about one more myth from me, and then we've got a couple more after that. So myth number 5 is that you may have heard that ranked choice voting contests can't be audited or recounted, and we're going to break that down now. The simple fact of the matter is ranked choice voting elections can and have been audited and recounted. San Francisco, North Carolina, and Minneapolis have all audited RCV elections, single winner and multi-winner, using conventional post-election audit methods. Recounts of RCV elections are similarly doable and done, and processes exist already in jurisdictions such as Minneapolis and Maine for conducting recounts. In fact, both of these jurisdictions conducted partial manual recounts of RCV races in 2017 and 2018, respectively, and conducted a statewide recount of their RCV election in 2010. Then last but not least, we previously mentioned the free open source RCV tabulation software developed by the Resource Center and our partners at Bright Spots. Benton County, Oregon recently asked the Resource Center to conduct an independent verification of their ES&S, the Election Systems and Software, RCV tabulation software, and a mock election that they used to actually test the systems. And this same type of independent cross-check can serve as a component of a post-election audit of the tabulation system for your jurisdiction as well. And I know I just said last but not least, but that's not quite accurate. One more thing to add on, and then I'll pass you on to George Gilbert. So some of you may have heard about risk limiting audits, which are an emerging form of post-election audit currently used in Colorado and being piloted across the country. We won't get into the details here. You can do that with our webinar and podcast on the subject if you're really interested. But risk limiting audits of ranked choice voting are being developed now. The complex theoretical work needed to prove their validity is progressing and is made substantial progress for single winner ranked choice voting. And work is being done to make sure that risk limiting audits of RCV can be up and running in the next couple of years. So now I'll pass you off to my colleague, George Gilbert, to talk to you about myth number 6.
Thank you, Chris. I've been asked to talk about the quasi-apocalyptic notion that implementation of RCV takes an inordinate amount of time, putting strain on personnel. I must begin with a confession. Years ago, as North Carolina prepared to implement the first statewide use of ranked choice voting since the 1930s, and we only had 86 days to prepare, I was quoted in one of the state's largest newspapers as saying North Carolina was headed for a train wreck. Fortunately, I underestimated the North Carolina State Board of Elections, as well as the 100 county election administrators, including myself. We proved me wrong, and this myth is wrong too. As Karen mentioned earlier, in 2010, North Carolina planned and implemented a statewide ranked choice voting contest general election that included 20 other races. Also in 2018, as mentioned, Maine planned and implemented a successful statewide ranked choice voting election in less than 100 days and without additional resources being appropriated. In 2018 as well, Santa Fe, New Mexico planned and implemented a successful ranked choice voting election in a little over 2 months. Elections are stressful, and changes in election procedures increase our anxiety and the strain on us all. More often than not, however, changes are simply a different way of doing things. Not harder, nor more expensive, nor more complicated. Adequate lead times with proper planning and preparations are always recommended. But for anybody who has worked in elections, as I did for 25 years, knows that change is part of the process and part of what you prepare for. In fact, in my experience, change often keeps election administration interesting. We try to remind our election colleagues and policymakers that implementing ranked choice voting elections follows largely the same protocols and procedures as any election. For example, their defined schedules exist for any election. There are deadlines for candidates to file. There are requirements for ballot preparation. There are requirements for voting equipment, programming, and testing. There are set times for voting to take place, and there are schedules and procedures for tabulating the votes, just to name a few. These scheduled events do not change when ranked choice voting is adopted as a voting method. An implementation plan for ranked choice voting incorporates all the elements of any successful election. While the design and content of the ballot and the instructions or other educational material may change, the process is substantially the same. Clearly, the state of your technology and the details of your state election law impact how readily RCV can be smoothly integrated into your processes. And to initiate ranked choice voting successfully, there is one unavoidable additional task you have to perform. You have to educate yourself and your staff. But then you've already started that process as reflected by your presence with us today. It is to help meet this need that we formed the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center to provide jurisdictions with new to RCV with a library of materials and best practices from other jurisdictions so no one would have to reinvent the wheel. The jurisdictions that have implemented RCV faced many of the same challenges that today's neophytes face. For the most part, those challenges were successfully met. And we are here to share those experiences, both successes and failures, with you. All elections require hard work and imagination. As Professor Juan Gilbert, no kin by the way, once observed during congressional testimony, he said, "Elections are not rocket science. They are more complicated than that." End quote. But we do them on a regular basis. So don't panic, and you too will avoid a train wreck. With that, I'll turn the presentation back over to Gary Bartlett to discuss the final myth that we're addressing today.
Thank you, George and team members. Our final myth is really more of a history lesson. The conception is that RCV has been repealed in numerous cities, so obviously there are issues with it. In reality, few places have adopted RCV have repealed it. Just 4 of 23 cities and counties have adopted ranked choice voting in the last 50 years that have actually repealed the method. As a matter of fact, there has not been a repeal in the last 8 years. But let's take a look at 4 repeal locations more closely. In Burlington, Vermont, ranked choice voting worked as intended. After rounds of counting and down to 2 candidates, the winner won 51% of the final vote. Unfortunately, the winner became involved in a public scandal. Opponents of RCV used the scandal to repeal the voting method as a referendum of the mayor. This situation was unfortunate in that neither RCV nor any election method can be held accountable for scandal. While several aspects influenced the repeal of RCV in Pierce County, Washington, most notable was the reinstatement of the top 2 system in the Supreme Court ruling that resolved an issue that changed how Washington conducted its primaries. Additionally, the county spent money that is no longer necessary to update older voting equipment for compatibility of RCV. Every jurisdiction since Pierce County's use in 2008 that has implemented RCV on a smaller budget, including the entire state of Maine and North Carolina. The repeal in Aspen, Colorado occurred because the city adopted a form of multi-winner that had not been implemented anywhere else. This resulted in problems with administration, voting equipment, and ultimately a lawsuit. The lesson learned is that better rules and legislation were needed, and those have since been developed and used elsewhere. With modern technology and other resources, RCV can be conducted properly and without unfortunate issues in Aspen. The fourth and final repeal dates back to the 1970s in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The city of Ann Arbor adopted RCV in 1974 for mayoral elections. Because a third party known as the Human Rights Party was acting as a spoiler in those elections. In the first and only election using single winner RCV in Ann Arbor, a black Democrat won the mayoral election thanks to the second and third choices from the supporters of the Human Rights Party. Prior to this election, the Republican Party had regularly won mayoral elections in the city. They challenged the law in court and lost, but they led a successful ballot initiative campaign to repeal RCV in Ann Arbor. Other factors, such as the quick fall of the Human Rights Party and changes in the base of student population vote, further influences unsettled political times for RCV. Rather than focus on repeals of the four cities, the true characterization of ranked choice voting is a growing use of this voting method. Today, 11 cities, plus the state of Maine, use RCV. 5 other states and the city of Springfield, Illinois, use this voting method for ballots to send to military and overseas citizens. And looking ahead, 14 more cities and counties are in the process of implementing or have adopted RCV. And now Rosemary will step in as the moderator for our Q&A portion of our presentation. We hope you have a lot of good questions for us. And thank you.
Thanks, Gary, and to all of our panelists for today. We're going to move right into the question and answer segment. Remember, if you do have any questions, a few of you already have, but if you have any questions thus far, please use the question box on the control panel to the right of your screen. I'm going to take a look real quick and see what kind of questions we have. We do have a few. If we by chance run out of time, we will certainly take an opportunity to answer all of the questions and submit those in written form to all of our attendees for today, along with a recording of the webinar or recording of this session. First question, does the Universal RCV Tabulator need to be EAC certified at the state and federal levels? I'm going to open that up to some of our other panelists to provide us with an answer.
I can answer that. This is George or Chris. I can give an initial answer, and that is it depends entirely on your state or local certification requirements. We are in the process right now of initiating federal testing for the tabulator. And while we cannot obtain EAC certification, we can certainly, we are pursuing certification by one of the EAC approved laboratories. When I say we can't obtain formal EAC certification, is because the EAC only certifies voting systems, and it does not yet certify voting system modules. So only entire voting systems currently are considered certifiable by the EAC. Now that is likely to change in the next version of the voting system guidelines, but for the time being, we're stuck with that. But yes, we will have certification from one of the federally approved laboratories, and if your state and local jurisdiction allows for the use of those certified software in that fashion, then you would be able to use it.
I'd just add that we're getting it tested by the labs specifically to do our best to follow those certification laws in states that require that sort of certification. But I think it's also something that will help give the tabulator legitimacy, and we hope will, for administrators, make them feel more comfortable with using the tabulator, even if their state doesn't necessarily require that sort of higher level of testing or certification.
Correct.
Okay, thanks, George and Chris. We'll move on to the next question. Let's see. Are any states holding Are any states holding presidential primaries for president in 2020 now planning on using RCV with 20 candidates and counting? This seems like a wonderful education opportunity. I'm not sure if I can see the entire question. Yep, wonderful educational opportunity.
I'll talk about this a little bit. I don't know if Karen, you have anything to add as well, but so Fair Vote, which is the big advocacy organization for ranked choice voting, has been doing work on this. And right now, people participating in the telecaucus in Iowa, so where they can dial in instead of having to be physically present at a caucus location, will be presented with the opportunity to use ranked choice voting to rank their candidates. That will be used to award 10% of the delegates. And again, it's early. I don't think this will change, but we're still about a year out where nothing is set in stone yet. Alaska and Hawaii, their state Democratic parties are considering using ranked choice voting for their primaries. I've heard discussions coming from other states. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but there were bills introduced in Maine, New Hampshire, and I believe there's been discussions happening in Nevada as well.
Yeah, I think you've covered them, Chris. In terms of the Democratic Party, the state parties do have to have their nomination plans into the DNC by May 3rd. So we're all going to know here soon. But yes, the most likely places seem to be Iowa, Nevada, Alaska, Hawaii, possibly North Dakota, and maybe Wyoming. So.
And that's all Democratic primaries. There hasn't been discussion on the Republican side, of course, because right now there's 2 candidates.
Thanks, Chris and Karen. Looking forward, when I asked you guys for questions, you did not disappoint. So we're going to try to get through as many as we can before we finish our time. Will the slides be downloadable as a PDF after the presentation? I can answer that question. We will be providing a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as any handouts and written documentation. So yes, it looks as though we could provide this slideshow as a PDF for use in other areas. If you have specific questions about formatting, just shoot us an email and we can work with any specific questions you may have about that. Or any other comments about that issue? We'll move on. Next question. So this completely eliminates the need for a typical primary election. RCV would then all take place on a single election day. I think the person is asking, what does it take place of?
That is an option. Different jurisdictions have different election methods. Some have a primary with a second primary, and then go to an election. Some have a primary election and a runoff. And so as different jurisdictions have utilized ranked choice voting, Some have eliminated their primary and just had a single general election, and some have continued to possibly have a primary and a general, but have removed the runoff aspect. So that varies greatly depending on the jurisdiction and what the benefit or the need of that jurisdiction is.
Right. Well, and I'll add, so Maine used ranked choice voting. They didn't get rid of any elections, but they just added ranked choice voting to their primary and general election. Whereas with the city of Minneapolis, they eliminated a primary and now just hold a single general election.
Okay, let's see, next question. What are some of the factors that are preventing Maine from running the rounds of counting on election night and required everything to be done at the state office?
I'm happy to answer this one because I seem to answer this quite often when we are asked for testimony. So, and any of my other colleagues, please fill in. But what we know from Maine is that their administration of elections does not include voting units, actual optical scanners in the polling places in about half of their voting places. So while they have printed ballots that can be run through a tabulator, a high-speed tabulator, those ballots from those jurisdiction or those precincts that have no voting unit, voting machine, those ballots had to be brought into Augusta for central tabulation. And they brought in the flash drives from the jurisdictions that, or excuse me, the precincts that do have voting equipment. So it required centralizing all of their voting, all of their ballots that have been voted in order to run the tabulation and to have that cast vote records that the tabulation software could aggregate. That actually took a period of time, obviously, to have those brought in, and that's how they would actually have conducted a recount. They've done that in the past for non-RCV races. Anytime they needed to conduct a recount, they had to centralize all the ballots. So that that is why there was a period of time. But it also kind of goes back to what Chris was saying about the canvass process. And in jurisdiction, the way elections work is that election night are unofficial results. And then you have a period of time where you have verification of provisional ballots, in some states, some allow for military and overseas absentee ballots to be received later and processed later. And so that canvass period, that certification periods that states go through may vary in the number of days, but there is a process before you actually get to official results, a period of days after election day. And so in many ways, that's really what Maine was going through, just like any state. They just had that added step of needing to cull together all the ballots that had been voted in the state on central tabulation.
This is George. I would just mention, for those of you not familiar with Maine, Maine has over 500 election jurisdictions that conduct their elections, and they're conducted at the municipal level. And when Karen says half of their jurisdictions, she's talking about over 200 of their jurisdictions are so small that they've historically count their ballots by hand. They do everything by hand in that. So that was really the magnitude of tabulation in Maine was incredible, that they were able to have all of the ballots statewide delivered to the central office before the end of the week. I was incredibly impressed with how quickly they got that job done. They brought in ballots from all over the state and had them tabulated in less than a week.
Okay, thanks, George. I got a couple other questions. Let's see, and then we'll sort of wrap it up for today. This question, you said all major voting system vendors now support RCV. That's new, I think, because last year only Dominion had that. What others are currently available?
Well, we're actually going to spend a good bit of time on this during our final session tomorrow afternoon. But during our symposium last year, we actually had the 4 largest vendors to present, and they all showed that they do have some level of RCV capability, and it just varies by the vendor. And if we can go into those details, but really it's probably better served for that next presentation, session 6. But yes, all 4 of the major vendors, Unison, Hart, InterCivic, ES&S, and Dominion all have the ability to capture RCV votes. Choices and rankings can be captured on their ballots and converted into cast vote records. And then Unison, ES&S, and Dominion have the ability to tabulate those votes. Hart does not have a tabulation module for RCV. George, do you want to add anything to that? That was a quick summary.
Tune in tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and I'll give you a little more detail.
That's right.
Thanks, guys. We've got time for about 2 more questions. Do you have a visualization of RCV that is easily understood by voters after the voting process?
I'll take this briefly and then also give a plug for session 6. So I think one thing that's important, or the slide from earlier in this presentation of the Center for Civic Design visualization is a good example of a really stripped down but still very effective visualization of ranked choice voting results for people. Center for Civic Design also just did a ton of work looking into ways that they thought would be most effective to show voters results for both single winner and multi-winner. And so you can find those reports on our website, rankedchoicevoting.org/usability, to see how they suggest you do it. But essentially, they just suggest you show information about each round before the round starts, saying who got elected in that round or who got eliminated and had their votes transfer, or if you're in a multi-winner election, if someone got elected and there's a surplus, how that surplus got transferred. And then, showing that visually as well, just sort of reinforcing with text and image repeating. That takes up sort of a lot of time to go step by step like that. So there's other ways of showing that are a bit more dynamic and try and show more information at once, but still not overwhelm people. And we can talk about that tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern time.
Thanks, Chris. Last question, and what is the status of RCV in North Carolina? Used in 2010, is it currently in use, and if not, why?
I'll answer that, Rosemary. There are 2 types of RCV elections that were held in North Carolina. One was a pilot program for municipalities. 2 municipalities signed up to do ranked choice voting. One was Cary, North Carolina. The other was Hendersonville, North Carolina. And Cary did it one time. Hendersonville would do it today, but the pilot program sunset in 2012, and nobody introduced legislation for that to continue. In 2010 was to use for the first vacancy election for appellate judicial candidates, and that was repealed along with a omnibus bill with several election law changes.
Any future RCV on the horizon for North Carolina, Gary?
There have been some legislation presented to put the vacancy elections for RCV back in place, but currently the city of Durham has just introduced legislation for a top 4 advanced voting method, and we certainly are going to do whatever we can to assist in that if it passes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say we certainly appreciate the contributions of our panelists, and we thank the attendees not only for your attendance, but some of the great questions you have given us. We've got quite a few we did not get to, and my apologies for that. We will work with our panelists to cover any answers to any of the questions we could not get to during this session. The document that comes forth from that will be posted along with our recording in the coming weeks on our website, rankedchoicevoting.org. Please check back with us, and of course we'll send you a notification when we do post that information. So just stay tuned. We'll make sure we get any and all information we can to anyone that's interested in it. At this time, I'd like to invite each of you to, if you're not already registered, to join us at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session, See How They Run, Campaigning as a Ranked Choice Voting Candidate. Shaping up to be a very good session, and we will see you then. Thanks again.